Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. My co-authors on this are a couple of people. One was formerly from Deakin, but he's just now retired, and another colleague from Monash. And I'm sure, considering it's about coming up towards 11 p.m. on Saturday night, they'd just love a phone call with any questions at the end of this presentation. So my presentation is really around a study that we did with practitioners, trying to understand any differences that they saw with corporate governance of IT, particularly between medium and smaller organisations. Quick outline, typical sort of presentation, quick introduction, quick grounding into the research questions, and then of course a lot of the presentation will be focused really around getting into some of the results and the insights that we generated from the research. So of course one of the ongoing concerns for firms is around getting value from IT delivery. Turn that down a bit. Value from IT delivery. If we start to have a look at the value of IT, it's really estimated to be around $3.8 trillion. So if we're spending that sort of money on IT in terms of helping with systems, helping with processes and so forth, how can we actually start to get value out of that IT? So our focus in this particular paper is really around the corporate governance of information technology, where we're starting to look at the role of boards, the role of leadership, and of course the role of organisational structures and processes. To facilitate that, of course, if you start to look around, then one area that starts to help with that is the frameworks and standards and those sorts of things that have been put out there by the professional bodies. So to help with corporate governance of IT, which is really just a subset of which is just a subset of corporate governance, of course we have tools and frameworks like Prince2, COBIT, IT and VAL-IT. What we've tried to do in this study is start to have a look at the practitioner views in terms of corporate governance of information technology. Why we've done that is when we did a quick search of the literature, we couldn't actually find a lot on that. Particularly what we tried to look at is what influences the practitioners, what are some of the challenges that they face with respect to corporate governance of IT, what are some of the perceived benefits that they get out of implementing corporate governance of IT, and with one of the standards, ISO 38500, which is to do with corporate governance of IT, what are their views on that particular standard and the different principles that actually make up that 38500 standard. There were 4 primary research questions that we tried to answer through this particular study. First one was really around what is the extent of awareness amongst IT and business executives regarding corporate governance of IT and the frameworks that go to help with that. How do the views of the different business executives concerning the corporate governance of IT actually differ if we're looking at different firm size between small and larger organisations? For organisations that actually had a corporate governance of IT policy, what are some of the practices that are followed? What influenced the adoption? What are some of the perceived benefits and challenges? And what are some of the mechanisms that they use to actually support that corporate governance of IT? And given our focus really on corporate governance of IT being the subset of corporate governance, we're really starting to try and look at the standard 38500 and to what extent are the 6 principles that are embedded in 38500, to what extent are those principles actually applied in organisations. So quick bit of background, where does this particular study fit in? As I said, we're really starting to look at corporate governance being the system that directs, that controls organisations. We're really focusing in on a subset of that being corporate governance of information technology. What we're trying to look at here is how can we actually use corporate governance of information technology to start to build capability, to start to build value in these organisations. All of us know there's been a long history around trying to generate value from IT. We look at the productivity paradox, we look at all of that sort of literature base. Often we start to conceptualise value through looking at the strategic business and information technology alignment. That can, of course, be quite challenging to actually get the alignment between the technology, between the business, to get these derived business values. What we're trying to look at here is how can corporate governance of information technology start to actually help with that. As I mentioned at the start, there's a number of framework standards, approaches that can actually help with corporate governance of information technology. And they're really trying to help in terms of building capability and increasing the value, and that includes COBIT, COSO, some of the more management frameworks, Prince2, right down to ITIL, and of course the standard 38500. In terms of a theoretical positioning for this particular study, we're really interested in tapping into aspects of the resource-based view. So in looking at that, we were trying to look at how can organisations that are constrained in their resources, financial, human and so forth, how can they use IT governance to start to help in terms of deliver some value. So what are the capabilities that we can get from building effective IT governance? A lot of that comes down, of course, to the alignment between the technology and the complementary resources that are embedded in the organisation. When we looked in the literature, we found little regarding the consensus about the benefits of the corporate governance of information technology and how that can actually be linked to the resource-based view. And of course, our focus in this study is, as the title suggests, starting to look at the differences between larger organisations and more medium-sized organisations, which, as we all know, face different sizes, have different resource constraints, different challenges that are actually presented to them. So our focus was very much in the Australian sector, hence because I'm from Australia and it was easier to tap into that audience. We're really interested in starting to compare the differences between these two sizes of organisations. Both, of course, make important contributions in terms of direct economic impact and in terms of employment contributions. Because the study was grounded in Australia, we used the Australian, or the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics definition for organisational size. The Australian Bureau of Statistics starts to define an organisation based on the number of employees. So for smaller firms, it's less than 20 employees. For medium-sized firms, it's 20 to 200 employees, and over 200 is classified as a large organisations. Most in our sample, therefore, fitted within the medium to larger organisation based on that definition. In terms of our method, we used a Qualtrics-based survey, which we administered over a period of 25 weeks, mainly because we did it at the end of 1 year, and so with close down and so forth, we left it open for a bit longer, end of 1 year across into the start of 2014. What we were trying to elicit through that particular survey was a number of the views of both the Chief Information Officer, IT directors, and those types of personnel within organisations. In terms of the focus of the survey, they are the key theme areas that we tapped into. Obviously understanding a bit about the people, but then particularly tapping into what was their use of IT governance frameworks and tools. What's their interpretation regarding corporate governance of information technology, their policies, their practices? What are some of the factors that actually influence their reason to actually adopt these types of frameworks? What are some of the benefits that we actually achieved from these adoption, and what are some of the challenges? And then, as I said, we're also interested in the corporate governance of IT standard. So we're interested in what was the applicability of the 6 principles that actually make up the corporate governance of information technology standard. In terms of our sample, there's a very quick snapshot. Our total sample was 143. We had about 190 people connect to the survey. Out of the 190 connections, we got 144 responses. One person just seemed all over the place, so we excluded that particular respondent, leaving a sample size of 143. Of that 143, under the ABS definition, 100 were from large organisations, 43 were from medium-sized organisations. You can start to see there the sort of key areas in terms of positions held by respondents, with CIO, IT directors were the two biggest categories. We know that people, particularly as I see it in the Australian context anyway, people are quite fluid in terms of moving through organisations. And I think that's reflected in the fact that the time in years in the organisation was predominantly under 5 years. In terms of the time in the organisation, approximately 60, nearly 70% is again under 5 years in terms of time there. The biggest industry sector represented in our sample was the government and administration and defence sector. So as I said, one of the things we wanted to look at was the frameworks and awareness and how well they'd actually implemented these governance frameworks. What we can start to see here on the left-hand side, of course, is that frameworks such as Val IT, COBIT and Risk IT were on the lesser end in terms of that particular scale. But something like COBIT, for example, was nearly double the amount of implementation in large organisations compared to medium-sized organisations. We start to have a look, unsurprisingly, I guess, in some respects, aspects like the more project management type tools, such as Prince2, were more dominant in terms of what we saw around awareness and implementation of the framework. We also started to ask them, here's 6 different options regarding the views about what does corporate governance of IT actually mean. So we presented them with the 6 different options and said, well, which one do you think actually represents better this understanding about what is corporate governance of IT? The 6 sources for those views came from a combination of practitioner sources and what was in the current literature at the time. The 2 that came up the highest in terms of what they saw as representing corporate governance of IT were really around a responsibility to the board of directors, trying to actually get those organisation systems and strategies and objectives, and really looking at it as a set of mechanisms to prioritise, to sponsor, to monitor, enforce, etc. around the technology. The one that was interesting in some way that came up the least viewed one was really around how does that actually help in terms of control in organisations. Policy, we started to actually have a look at the policy statements. As you can start to see there, did the firms actually have a written policy? Yes, they actually tended to have one, about 50% of that. We then started saying, well, okay, if you don't have a policy, and a few people chose not to actually answer the question, so if they didn't have one or they opted not to answer it, we went from 143 down to 81. We started to ask them what was their involvement in writing or developing that particular policy. And as you can see, most of them that then went on and answered the next set of questions around involvement, around implementation, actually did have some involvement. The CIO tended to be the one that had responsibility for updating it. Implementation in medium-sized firms was predominantly the CEO. In larger organisation, it was predominantly the CIO. In terms of updating, in medium, more sort of on an ad hoc basis. In larger organisations, more of an annual type of activity. Communication of it, yes, it was communicated and tended to be via the intranet site was the most common means. Without any predefined categories, we asked respondents to come up with what were their top 3 influences for developing CGIT-related policies. In terms of the most dominant ones, risk management tended to come up as the most frequently occurring of those particular influences. Been about 49% and been about 30% in terms of the phrases that we actually saw coming through in the open-ended question. Next was strategic alignment. In terms of some of the benefits that were achieved, the top 3 benefits that were actually achieved from implementing it, unfortunately only 59 of the 143 answered this question. Top benefit was alignment with business needs. Second to top benefit was clarity around the organisation's personnel, and clarity of responsibility among the organisation was the third top one there. I think I might have an error. In terms of the ones that were statistically significant, the top ones where there was a difference between the medium and the large organisations was really around cost savings, the clarity around the personnel, and really the efficient allocation of the resources. Similar to the influencers, we asked them what were your top, through an open-ended question, what were your top 3 challenges in putting corporate governance of IT in organisations? And resource management came out as the top one, with performance management coming out least in those. In terms of 38,500, highest agreement was really around responsibility, acquisition and conformance. Strongest disagreement in terms of the application of the principles was really around one particular aspect of responsibility, strategy, and another aspect to do with performance. In terms of structures, processes and mechanisms, for the structural mechanism, the dominant one we saw coming through was the IT Steering Committee. For planning, it was really around service level agreements. For mechanisms, it was really around regular briefings. And for training, it was really around online use of training. The only one that was really significant in terms of the difference between medium and large firms was really around the steering committee. Interestingly, one of the lower ones was really around the alignment model, yet we claim that strategic IT alignment is one of the benefits. I'm going to go through these because I'm getting told to actually wrap up. So definitions was really around the strategic nature, the processes, factors that influenced it. For large, regulatory; for medium-sized organisations, really processes. What enhanced awareness? For large, they were more proactive in having a written governance policy. Medium had one under development. For influencers, for medium firms, the internal processes. For larger organisations, they were really interested in the governance, in the outcomes. For all firms, the key challenges with delivering corporate governance of IT and getting benefit was really around ensuring an understanding, looking at strategic alignment, and ensuring organisational capability. In terms of some of the key benefits, well, for those with a written policy, they tended to achieve alignment with the business needs. There tended to be more clarity around the accountability and responsibility, and there also tended to be improved stakeholder engagement coming out. For 38,500, they tended to deliver on acquisition and conformance, but had some challenges around putting in the strategy to deliver that, and of course actually measuring the performance that came out of having 38,500 or some form of governance in the organisations. The key influences were really risk management was seen as quite a lot more important in the larger organisations. For corporate governance of IT, very much a top-down written policy statement that came through. Obviously, it is limited because it is only being conducted in the Australian context, and while we have done some surveys with some quant and some qualitative answers, obviously that can lead to different interpretations. One way of actually helping to extend and tap into this at a deeper level would be to go back and actually interview some of the CIOs, IT directors in these organisations. So that's a quick snapshot in terms of what we saw as some of the interesting insights around larger organisations and medium organisations' approaches to corporate governance of IT. Really, human engagement was one of the primary challenges, which I thought was quite interesting coming through that.